Hello, my name is Madelyn Treat, and I'm here today to present Words from the Female Confederacy, analyzing the effect of location on women's perceptions of the Civil War. The Civil War affected everyone living in America, changing both their lives and the state of their country forever. Among those touched by the conflict were 10 women from Virginia and Tennessee who recorded their experiences in diaries. This study compared and contrasted these works in order to discover if and what effect physical location had on these women's perceptions of the war. Here we see a map of Virginia during the war, and I have placed markers in the various places where the women or the diarists that we looked at lived for most, if not all, of the time that they were writing in their diaries. In place number 1, we have Winchester, which was home to multiple battles and switched hands between the North and the South multiple times during the war. It was an agricultural center, so both sides desperately wanted it. In spot number 2, we have Charlottesville, which was a manufacturing and medical center that saw little action and basically no battles. So even in these two places, which are relatively close to one another, we can see that there's a huge diversity in experience based on physical location, and we'll continue to see that as we look at the other places on these maps. In spot number 3, we have Front Royale, which was briefly occupied by the Union before the Confederates kicked them out. In spot number 4, we have Richmond, the capital of Virginia, which was a place where displaced refugees flooded to throughout the war, and this caused a huge scarcity of goods and housing and other things that negatively impacted almost all of the people living there. And finally, in place number 5, we have Norfolk, which was near an important military post that was captured by the Union early on. Here we have the women who lived in those various places. And you can see here that this is a very diverse group of ladies. Our oldest is 52, while our youngest is 18. Household sizes during the Civil War tended to be larger, but even here you can see that there's a huge amount of diversity in that. Our largest household size is 13, while our smallest at one point is 2. Slaves, almost all of the women whose diaries I read did have slaves. Not all of them kept detailed records of how many slaves they had, and not many of them didn't really mention their slaves at all or really in depth, but most of them did have at least some. And to our right, you can see the various experiences that they had based on where they were living and stuff like that. Here is the map of Tennessee. You can see in spot number 6, we have Rogersville, which was mostly controlled by Confederates with short stints of Union occupation. In spot number 7, we have Knoxville, which was under Union occupation for most of the war. In spot 8, we have Cleveland, which was home to brief skirmishes throughout the war. In place number 9, we have Pulaski, which also saw skirmishes but was occupied by the Union for most of the war. And in spot 10, we have Clarksville, which was occupied by the Union and saw little military activity. It's important to note which side controlled a certain region or town at any given point, because that greatly affected the standard of living of the people there. Since all of the women that we are looking at here are Confederate women, if the places they were living were occupied by the Union, they were usually worse off than they would be otherwise. And here we can see our Tennessean Diarists, and you can see a similar diversity reflected here that we saw with our Virginian ladies. Our oldest here is 45, while our youngest is 15. Our largest household size is 14, while our smallest is 4. You can see the varying numbers in slaves yet again, and the varying types of experiences that the women had. So we've seen at surface level that these women had very little in common. Not only did they experience different things based on where they were living, but they were also just different people. Each woman was at a different point in her life, a different age. They came from different family backgrounds and had different economic situations. So what are we studying here? What are we comparing? Well, all of these women identified as Confederates. And this identity as Confederates led to me discovering 4 fundamental themes that were prevalent in each and every one of their diaries. These themes being faith in God, struggle to accept change, a reliance on their communities, and sentiments of righteous superiority. Now, each woman used her diary in a different way. Some used it to express her emotions, some to record the straight and dry facts of the day, some to follow the events of the war, and so on and so forth. But even though they all used their diaries for different purposes, these 4 themes were widely and extremely prevalent in each and every one. The first theme that we'll look at is faith in God. Like most Americans during the time, these 10 women were all Christian, though they had different levels of dedication to said religion and expressed their dedication in various ways. But they all turned to God for support and stability. Obviously, any war is a very unstable time for the people living through it. And these women could do very little to make their situations more stable. They believed that God would take care of them and even that he would guarantee a Southern victory. And this is a very comforting thought. If you think you have a God on your side who wants you to win, then there is very little chance that you will lose. And so this was a very comforting thought that they used to handle the extreme amount of change in their lives. And we see here in the second theme that there is a huge amount of change going on and that they really struggled to accept and handle this change. For example, the breakdown of the family circle was something that every woman struggled with throughout the war. Family was obviously very important to these women, and so were the lives of the men that they were losing, or at least losing for a short period of time because of the war. And they really struggled with the fact that their family might never look the way it did before the war. It was devastating to them that their families might not be whole again, and they really struggled to accept that. They also struggled to handle the changes in circumstances that happened because of the war, the new roles that they had to take on. Most of the women became economically worse off throughout the war, and they had to learn how to deal with that, but they also just had to learn how to deal with the new duties that they were dealt. As men went off to war or slaves ran away, they had to take on new responsibilities, and sometimes these were hard for them to do. They also had to deal with the disruption of formally established social customs, particularly established death rituals. Obviously, they could not observe the rituals that they had before the war. Sometimes most of the time, they did not have the bodies of their dead, and they could not honor them in the way they had before the war, and this deeply disturbed the women. And finally, they had to deal with uncertain and destroyed futures. Not only did they not know what the world was going to be like after the war, they did not know if everyone they loved would have a future, and they really struggled with all of this. Alongside believing in God, they used their community to help them get through all of this struggle and change. As you can see in these two quotes, they used their community for practical support. They gathered supplies, made uniforms, took care of soldiers, and spread news. And here you can see that they used each other for emotional support as well. You can see Eliza Fane took comfort in the fact that she was not suffering alone and that she had people who could relate to her struggles. Finally, and most importantly, we have the theme of righteous superiority. Each and every diarist vehemently believed that the Southern people were inherently superior. This idea was usually expressed at the very start of all their diaries, at the start of the war, where they complained that the South was being bullied by the North. They saw the South as a passive victim, and they believed that everything would have been fine if the North had just left well enough alone. These feelings eventually developed to feelings of complete moral superiority. You can see here, Nanny Haskins says, the 3,000 Yankees who passed through here were a set of cutthroats, incendiaries, murderers, and cowards. You can see she feels entirely comfortable and confident making a huge generalization about a large group of people, and she is saying that they're all morally deficient in some way or another. And here Ellen House makes the opposite point. She says, how these Yankees do pry into every little thing, things that a gentleman and Confederate would never think of. She's putting Confederate men on a high, high pedestal and putting Union soldiers way below them, and she feels entirely confident doing that. And this sort of thing is found throughout every single diary. So we've seen that despite all of their diversity, these women had commonalities that they expressed in their diaries. But now we come to the real question. Why is any of this important? Though these women lived and wrote down their stories almost 200 years ago, we can use the common themes in their diaries to examine our own coping mechanisms. After all, do we not also turn to higher powers for support in times of trouble? Can any of us say that we've never struggled with all the change that's been thrown our way during the past year? Surely we've all turned to our own communities for support sometime or another as we've tried to handle said change. And though we might not want to admit it, I'm sure we all have felt superior in one way or another to a person or group that's done us harm. By examining historical documents such as Civil War diaries, we can learn how we tend to react to tragedy and change and work to improve that reaction. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Here are the 10 diaries that I studied, the sources that I used to support the observations that I made during that study, and finally, the images I used in this presentation. Thank you.